Robert Daly is director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Robert, welcome to Wilson Center Now.
Thank you.
I want to ask you something you said very fascinating on a briefing you were doing for your colleagues in-house that I sat in on, where you talked about if China is going to become a world power in the way that the United States is recognized as a world power, that it's reached a point where it can no longer simply be a foil to the United States. It has to develop its own voice. How's it doing in that regard?
So far, it's not doing terribly well, despite efforts. The voice that it's projecting, at least over the past year, has tended to sound a little bit too assertive to foreign ears, not only in the United States, but among its Asian neighbors as well. You hear the words assertive, bellicose fairly often. And it's not only been its words, but it's been China's actions as well. It's having a hard time telling its own story.
Is this a cultural issue?
I think that it's cultural, but it also has to do with the particular style of the Chinese Communist Party, which is very accustomed to being both its own mouth and ear, and to not having its own propaganda and its own self-descriptions questioned. And now it's discovering, understandably, that it can't treat foreign publics, foreign audiences, the way that it treats its own people. It is going to be met with skepticism. It is going to be met with irony. It is going to be met with facts and counterclaims.
Mm-hmm. Are Chinese leaders thinking about this in the same way that we're talking about it? Do they realize that this is a challenge for them?
I think yes. I think that it's coming. Certainly Xi Jinping, the new leader of China, the way that he presents himself, he's very confident. He's very sort of macho in some of the ways that Putin is macho, and in a way that I think goes down well with an awful lot of the folks in China. He's much better stylistically than either of his two predecessors. And some of his other co-leaders in the Chinese Communist Party also are talented diplomats. They're still in the minority, but they know there's a problem, and they are getting better at it.
I was trying to think about a roadmap for this challenge for a nation, and is there one? Is there historical precedent of a nation rising to power in such a manner? Is it the United States? Where would it be?
No, there is no precedent. People are reaching for them, and especially this year, people are reaching for 1914, with the implication that China is playing the role of Germany, of aggressor. None of these historical analogies works very well. China's rise is different. Its scope and its speed have been faster and larger than those of any previous rise. And one of the most important things about China's rise, and the source of some of its difficulty, even its bellicosity, is this. In every previous rise, including the American rise, the rise of the European powers, rises occurred where there was still space, geographic space. The European powers were able to take colonies. America had manifest destiny and its own spread to the West. China is the first major nation to rise on an unprecedented scale, at an unprecedented pace, where there is no room. Every single space on the checkerboard is occupied with sovereign nation states. There's no geographic space. China finds no normative space. No other country has risen where there are already bodies of international law that constrain them. And China also feels that there is no discursive space. They talk about this a lot. The rules for international discourse, what is legitimate and what is not, have been set so that China doesn't even feel able to tell its own story. So think about that. The United States rise with the Atlantic, the Pacific, more or less friendly neighbors to the north and south, no threats in its hemisphere, and lots of room to grow.
Yeah, geography as destiny.
China has 14 neighbors land, 4 of whom are nuclear, none of whom is a traditional ally, some of which it has land disputes. And then, of course, it's got maritime neighbors as well where there are disputes. So a very different neighborhood than the United States enjoys.
You mentioned the bellicosity factor a couple times. And, you know, China's not the only one who sort of can take on that tone.
Right.
The United States has benefited in sometimes from having a foil, having someone to play against internationally. Newt Gingrich famously more than once has talked about conservatism needing an enemy to really manifest its vision around. Is China filling the role that the old Soviet Union played for the U.S. in that regard?
China makes this claim regularly, that any criticism of China is, by its very nature, a Cold War mentality, and it comes from America's need to have a hypothetical enemy. I think that you hear some criticisms from the United States that do seem to fall into that category, where we want to criticize China, some critics of China, at least in part to feel good about themselves or to make declarations about America's virtue, America's indispensable qualities. So that's a claim that China is quick to make. But it's not only the United States that raises these criticism, and I think that this puts the lie to some of China's claims about this. Smaller, weaker, non-arrogant nations also are concerned about elements of China's rise. So yes, there are people in America who would like a foil, but we also have legitimate reasons to be concerned about China's legitimate rise. And I do want to emphasize that China's rise in the main is legitimate. It represents human striving, the desire to have better life. And one of the things that we need to say to China, one of the messages is, congratulations, this isn't easy. But then we do have legitimate concerns that also need to be recognized.
What could we learn about the current state of U.S.-Chinese relations from the impending sending of a new ambassador to China and the Senate confirmation hearings that just took place?
Well, the confirmation hearings were fairly interesting. It was a bit of a love fest. He's a senator, and these are his colleagues who are clearly going to confirm Senator Baucus, soon to be Ambassador Baucus. And I think that in his prepared statement, he touched on the importance of engagement, of economic relations as a foundation of U.S.-China relations. He also touched on the importance of human rights and ideology. What most struck me listening to that was that he came very close to denying the validity of this phrase, the United States and China have a new model of major power relations. This was a proposal, a rubric, hasn't been filled in. It's largely empty. It's only a kind of a good wish for U.S.-China relations that China put forward, but that Obama confirmed at his Sunnylands session with Xi Jinping last summer. And Senator Baucus said, I'm very wary of that formulation. It seems to mean that China wants to reign supreme in its sphere and let the United States hold sway in its sphere. And that was also echoed by Senator Rubio, underscored by Senator McCain. And so even though this wasn't picked up on by the American press, I'm sure Chinese leaders heard something very close to a rejection of their major formulation for U.S.-China relations.
Final question for now, Robert, because as we've discussed, this is only the beginning of a discussion that we're going to have over time and develop these issues in more depth. But looking ahead in the near-term future, is there an event that we can anticipate, a global meeting, something that will give us another litmus test for how China is doing in their rise?
Well, there are going to be a number of things coming. There's a meeting of the National People's Congress in March, which will flesh out some of the policy announcements that were made last November. President Obama will be in Asia, although not in China, in April. And even though I say he won't be in China, he'll be mostly in Southeast Asia. He'll go to Japan. People are calling for him to go to South Korea. China is the elephant in the room, is the subcontext of a lot of those trips. And then President Obama will almost certainly go to China in September. And these are the major anticipatable moments we should look for. But U.S.-China relations has a way of throwing wild cards on the table when you don't anticipate them. And so we need to be alert for those as well.
And we'll have you back when those emerge and we can talk about them.
Happy to discuss it.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.